Hello, fellow aviators. Welcome to JPL Aviation, where leadership and aviation take off. We actually had the ability to interview Max Trescott, who we are extremely grateful to have on the show. He was a 2008 National CFI of the Year, selected to represent all 96,000 flight instructors in the U.S. He's written 2 books, including Max Trescott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. He has online courses for the G1000 at pilotlearning.com. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a Cirrus Platinum CSIP instructor. He teaches full-time in Cirrus aircraft, and he's also type-rated in the Cirrus S550 Vision Jet. You can hear him talk about general aviation and Cirrus aircraft every week on his free podcast, which is called Aviation News Talk, which you can find anywhere and get your podcasts. You can also find his dedicated app in the Apple Store and Google Play Store by searching for Aviation News Talk. So fast forward to the interview. It was my first time doing it on Skype, and though the audio and video quality didn't come out the best, I learned how to redo it for next time, but I hope you guys enjoy. Go check it out. We had some great moments where we talked about aviation safety. As long as Max was involved in most scenarios, he was able to handle everything that he came across. And also we were able to talk about the different things that make up a good CFI. So if you have questions on how to find a good CFI, Max Trescott is your guy. Make sure to go check out Aviation News Talk, and JPL Aviation is where leadership and aviation take off. Welcome, Max.
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for having me here.
No problem. Is there anything I missed on that list that you might want to add, or?
Well, I would just add that I wasn't a CFI at age 15.
Oh,
that kind of sounded like that. No, I started taking lessons when I was 15. Didn't become a CFI until many years later.
And when did you become a CFI-ish?
You know, about 18, 19 years ago. It was the day before 9/11 I got my CFI, so September 10th, 2001, which was a little odd because the following day, flight instruction pretty much shut down for the next 6 weeks.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. So let's just kind of start with how you got into aviation. You as a kid, right? Nobody at 15 years old just goes, "Oh, I'm going to start flying planes." So if you can give me a little bit of background.
I think it actually starts earlier than 15. A lot of people I talk to get the bug, when they're quite young. So in my case, the local airport was offering rides, in which was like $5 a person. Now this was back in the 1970s, and they would take you for, I don't know, a 20-minute flight around town or something like that. So Mom, my sister, and I all piled in the airplane, and I'm guessing I was, 9 or 10 or 11 or somewhere around that age, and I was just totally hooked. So, from then on, I wanted to, read everything I could about aviation. I got Flying Magazine as a teenager. I couldn't wait to be old enough to start flight lessons, which, for me was age 15. And it was kind of funny because I was learning to fly an airplane, but I was too young to have a driver's license, so my mother had to drive me to the airport.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's one of those things that I wish I would have personally done in my flight training, was that I found out only until senior year of high school, so I was 18 years old, that you can actually become a pilot, at 17 years old. And I was like, what the heck? I could have been in high school flying airplanes, and talk about being the coolest kid on the block, right?
Well, perhaps. And the other thing, and I say perhaps because it's not going to be appealing to everybody, but for those of us who love aviation, yeah, it is way cool. I mean, the other option is gliders. You can solo a glider at age 14. And with the motor gliders today, they're substantially the same as an airplane. So people can actually get started flying even earlier.
So that's a good option to go as well for anybody who's young and listen to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as you got that first intro flight, how did you kind of first start getting into your actual training? What was your steps, your processes?
Sure. I would say it was a little unstructured in the sense that the flight instructor didn't lay out for me, all the different steps. And so I would just kind of, started with lesson number 1, and then eventually found out, oh, we've got to do this, and oh, we've got to do that, and so on. But they were just half-hour lessons in a Cessna 150, which to me seems a little bit short when I'm teaching folks. A typical lesson is probably, an hour and a half. We just go to the airport every week or two. And the other thing that would made it doable with just a half hour is I grew up in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, which is in north central PA. It is, the smallest, I mean, literally the biggest town for 50 miles in all directions, 4,000 people. So it's, there was not much traffic up there from an airplane standpoint. So the moment we took off, we could begin practicing maneuvers. We could do landings. I'm at a very busy airport now at Palo Alto in Northern California, and we typically fly probably close to 15 minutes away now just to get to a place where we can practice maneuvers. So it's very different from that standpoint. But basically, I let my instructor guide the process. So I would show up, fly a lesson, and eventually got to solo. I still shudder to think that I soloed with 9.5 hours of flying time. These days, when I solo people, it's always much, much more than that. But it's also at a busy towered airport, and the rules, the regulations, the airspace has gotten a lot more complicated. In the 40 plus years since I soloed, and eventually my instructor kind of let me know, we've got to do some maneuvers, and we've got to do some cross country flights, and by the way, you have to do a written exam. And I was like, what? Written exam?
Am I smart enough for that?
Yeah. And so ultimately, it ended up taking 4 years because I was doing a whole bunch of other things. I got my second year in college. So I was a sophomore. And, I just did it a little bit at a time. Initially, my parents paid for it. And then the last couple of years, I was paying for it. But it was very satisfying. Of all the things I learned in my youth, that's one of the things I value the most was, learning how to become a pilot.
Well, of course, that's one of the greatest accomplishments that, I think personally you can do as an aviator, because you become part of that top, what do they say, 2% of the world that's ever flown an airplane before.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's an accomplishment in itself to be able to write that on your resume, be like, hey, I did this cool thing,
Sure.
And
it's great fun.
100%. There's nothing like it, And so my thing is, when you first started, obviously small town, was there just like a couple pilots in the area that you went out to? Was there a local flight school that you kind of went for, or how did you kind of find the process of becoming a pilot?
Well, there was that one guy. He was everything at our airport.
Small town.
Richard Johnson. He had a charter service, and so he used to fly people or packages around. He would give flight instruction. If somebody wanted to buy an airplane, he would go pick up the airplane for them at the factory and bring that back. So he did everything. He was in his 50s when I started learning from him. And I still remember lesson number 1. We talked for a few minutes about the airplane. We climbed in, and he said, "Now you take off." And I was like, "What?" I was so shocked. It's like, what do you mean I'm going to take off? I was blown away as a 15-year-old kid to think that I was going to do the takeoff. But I did, and it worked out fine. The airport, by the way, now 40 plus years later, is named, for Richard Johnston.
So was he kind of like a mentor for you, or who was like somebody throughout your pilot training? Did you have somebody in your life that was like your mentor to go to, or was it just yourself?
I think he inspired me in at least one aspect. At one point, he was the Pennsylvania Flight Instructor of the Year, and I thought, wow, pretty lucky that I have a guy who's, been named top flight instructor in Pennsylvania. And so I think when I ultimately became a flight instructor, that inspired me, and then was later named as the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And I was so proud to contact Dick and call him up on the phone and just let him know, hey, guess what?
That's what I did, yeah.
Yeah, he was very excited, and I think I feel that myself about my students' accomplishments. When somebody solos, I feel almost as excited as they do, when they solo. So that's one of the great satisfactions that I get from teaching. But beyond that, I would say, no, I haven't had a mentor per se. I've had a number of good, if not great, flight instructors, and I've tried to learn something from each of them.
What made a good flight instructor for yours, in your opinion? It's the aspect of somebody's looking for a flight instructor. What makes someone a good flight instructor for a student?
Well, a couple things. One, they have to be patient. You really don't want somebody who's kind of yelling at you in the cockpit. And so to me, someone who's patient is probably one of the most important criteria. But then another one really is feeling like you trust, that flight instructor, that you have a relationship with them. If you don't trust and respect the flight instructor, either you're not going to learn as much for them, or you're going to be scared, when you're with them. So you got to really feel confident that that person has your best interest at heart and is going to make you successful. Because this is a you bet the farm proposition. If you do it badly, you die. And there are not too many things in life have the stakes that are that high. So you really want to, shop around and make sure you've got a great flight instructor. Don't just, take the first one that you run into. You really want someone who's good, who's got some experience, and enjoys teaching. I think that the sad, dirty laundry of the flight training industry is that there are a number of flight instructors who are doing it just because they have to pay their dues. It's the only way for them to build the hours that they need to go on and become an airline pilot if that's what they want to do. So some of those folks are indeed, good instructors, but a lot of them, they kind of make it clear in terms of how they interact with you that, this is just, a side gig for them, and it's not something that they're fully invested in.
You're just a number at that point, right? You're like, hey, you're X amount of hours for me, so let's get this thing done, right?
Yeah. You're a means to an end for me. You're punching my meal ticket for me.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so through your process of aviation training, so obviously, how did you get your ratings? What was how long did it take? What was the process for that?
Well, I had my private for, about 13 years before I went and got my instrument. So I was well into my early 30s by the time I got my instrument rating. I, at the time, got my first job after college with Hewlett-Packard, working at a division there in New Jersey. And I started flight training for my instrument rating first at the Caldwell Airport in Essex County, New Jersey. And then I moved over to Hackettstown. But I was not really impressed with one of the instructors, I had. It was like lesson number 2, and he wants me to fly an ILS. And he wasn't really telling me how to do it, but he just said, "You can do it. You can do it." And it's like, how am I supposed to do it? I'm glad you have this great confidence in me, but you haven't told me what it is I'm supposed to do and how to do it. So that was the last time I flew with him. And then in the middle of it, I ended up transferring to California. That's where Hewlett-Packard's headquarters is. And I had lived out here for about 3 months on a temporary assignment. And I just fell in love with Silicon Valley. There's just so many great things about it here in Northern California. And so then I, within a few months, picked up on my instrument rating again and finished that. Years later, I just kind of thought, hey, let's just keep moving up the food chain. I got my commercial for no particular reason other than I figured it would make me a better pilot. Got my twin engine rating, probably for pretty much the same reason. And then I really, really, really lucked out. In the summer of 2001, a friend of mine said very simply, he said, "Max, I'm going to get my CFI rating. You should too." That's all he said. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. You're right. I should get my CFI rating. And it happened to be at a time when particular job I was in was in sales, and it was just bad luck that I was given a territory where I knew that no matter what I did, I was not going to make quota that year. And so I just thought, all right, I'm just going to, instead of really working myself to death trying to make the impossible happen, which wasn't going to happen that year in that particular territory, I'm going to use the time to go get my flight instructor certificate. And it was very eye-opening to me that studying to become a CFI is very different than getting any other, typical rating that you might as a pilot. A lot of it is self-study, and a lot of it is just geared toward learning how to teach as opposed to, performing a series of maneuvers, which is typically what most check rides are about. So for that check ride as a CFI, they want to see, can you fly from the right seat? Can you talk and fly at the same time? And can you teach and demonstrate all the various maneuvers? So I really got the CFI just happenstance, but I'm so happy I did, as it provided a great second career. And I have a lot more fun now as a flight instructor, I think, than I did when I worked in high tech.
So you've been instructing for how long now?
Gosh, 18 plus years now.
And how many students do you think you've passed through?
Oh, wow. I couldn't even guess. There are so many folks who I may see one time, or folks who, I give all of their training to. And it varies everywhere in between. But I would guess that I've probably sent at least 50 people to their privates and instruments and, things like that. Relatively few commercials and other ratings, but I would say I do a lot of privates, a lot of instrument ratings.
Do you have anybody that you once instructed in the airlines now?
Oh, I do. Absolutely. In fact, a couple of people I can think of. One went off to Hawaii and was flying for, I guess it's Hawaiian Airlines. I'm not sure the exact name. She was flying turboprops there. And another one is a doctor. He's a radiologist, and he just got a real bug about flying. So did the finish up training for him to get him ready for his airline interview. And he now flies for SkyWest, and when he's not flying, he still does radiology, since it's one of those medical professions where you can pretty much schedule it, in the middle of the night if you want. People just have X-rays that they need read, and it doesn't matter where you are or when you do it. So he does both jobs.
Yeah, it's crazy how kind of life can take you. You may think you're going to be a pilot, next thing you know, you're a radiologist. So that's awesome. And your process of getting the CFI and commercial, what age were you when you kind of completed all that? Because obviously you said you finished your private in college, second year. So what was after? I'm kind of trying to get a timeline set up.
I don't remember when I got my commercial, but I got my private when I was 19, got my instrument rating, in my early 30s, got my commercial probably before I was 40, and got my CFI in, let me think, my early to mid 40s.
Awesome. So that means that you kind of just definitely progressed slower, but also you maximized your time is what it seems like.
Absolutely. And I didn't really have aviation in mind as a career. For me, it was just fun. I love to fly. And for many, many years, I probably averaged 30 hours a year. And it's just something that I used to do on the side, on weekends. But then ultimately, I kind of figured that, hey, this could actually be a career. And as I said, I'm just having a lot of fun doing it.
Might as well do it. So you also specialize in Cirruses, correct?
I do, yeah.
Can you tell me more about the Cirrus as an airplane? Because I've personally flown Cessnas. So I think the common training airplane is a Cessna. So for people who are looking to transfer over to Cirruses or working with the G1000, can you kind of give a little brief description what that transition is like and also about the aircraft?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. First, I would say, from a philosophical standpoint, I believe that people should specialize in something and get really, really good at that. And I think that's true in your work career, whatever it might happen to be. And definitely as a flight instructor, I've tried to do that. So early on, I decided to specialize in glass cockpits. And I think, CFIs who try to be all things to all people, and, they just work with whatever customer comes through the door, no matter what their problem or what their aircraft, you may be kidding yourself as to, how good you really are in, any of these things. It's probably hard to be an expert at GPS, glass cockpits, tail wheel flying, and aerobatics. Maybe there's someone out there who's the top of their field in, all those areas, but I think it's unlikely. So I specialized first in glass cockpits, and probably at least 10, 12 years ago, just stopped teaching in anything but glass cockpits. So I did a lot of teaching in Cessnas, Diamond DA-40s, Columbia 400s, and of course the Cirrus. And then about 2 years ago, I just decided, boy, I think I really like the Cirrus so much, and I think that it's safer that I'm going to further specialize and only teach in Cirrus aircraft. And the funny thing is, when I decided to do that, I only got busier, and I ended up raising my rates because I just had too many people, banging on the door looking to fly with me. The Cirrus is the best-selling aircraft, the best-selling piston aircraft these days. It has been probably the most popular selling model, the SR-22, for at least 10 years now. So there are more of those that are sold every year than 172s or any other individual model. The aircraft are they have a lot of great features. One of which most people know is the parachute. I'm glad to say that I've never had to pull it, but if I ever had to, I wouldn't hesitate to do it. I have pulled it in the simulator a couple of times, and I can tell you that, it's a bit of a ride. You're going to be rocking and rolling quite a bit, if you end up, reaching up and having to pull the red handle. But if you look at the safety rate and the history, it used to be, prior to about 4 or 5 years ago, Cirrus aircraft had more fatal accidents per year than they had parachute pulls. And when people started analyzing the fatal accidents, they realized that, about a third of these people who died in Cirrus aircraft, probably, if they just used the airport, if they just used the parachute, they probably would have survived. And so then there was a big training campaign to pull early and pull often, to kind of encourage people, hey, use the parachute. And almost immediately, those two axes on the graph kind of crossed each other. The number of fatal accidents kind of declined, the number of parachute pulls, started going up. And these days, when you look at the accident rate for different periods of time, the Cirrus has a better accident rate than general aviation aircraft as a whole. Now, that was not always true. In the early days of the aircraft, it had a significantly higher accident rate. And I'm sure some people remember that and think, oh, these aircraft aren't safe. That's old data. The new data is that, these aircraft are incredibly safe if you are trained properly, and if you, follow the standard operating procedures that Cirrus provides. From a training perspective, Cirrus, I think, does more than any other piston aircraft company in terms of specifying how they want their aircraft flown. So they've had a document for years called the FOM, or Flight Operations Manual, that details every particular maneuver, every type of landing. These are the 8 or 9 steps to follow to perform it. So I would say that if I were to compare it with a Cessna, I would say that there are more systems, and so there's a little bit more complexity to the aircraft. So there's more to learn about the aircraft. You're going to be landing a little bit faster. A typical 172, you might land at 65 knots. An older SR-20, you could land at 75 knots, which would be the slow flight speed. But typically, the landing speed is 80 knots. So things happen a little bit faster. You've got to be kind of more prepared to kind of, keep up with it. Keep up with the airplane. You don't want to get behind the aircraft. So it is a little bit more demanding in terms of learning how to fly it, but it's also incredibly satisfying because it's just a very capable aircraft. And if you want to go somewhere, wow, it's nice to be doing that at 180 knots versus 110.
Yeah, compared to the Cessnas, you're just tooting along, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So when you're teaching your students in the Cirrus, what is your main focus as you're teaching? Are you focusing more on kind of the actual flying itself, or are you really making sure their ground is amazing so that they understand every time you go up and fly? Kind of what's your method behind it is what I'm trying to get at.
Yep. So I would say both are important. And what I typically do for people who come to me that want to learn to fly in the Cirrus, if they're already a private pilot, I'll give them a rather large document that I've compiled over the last dozen or 12, 13 years that I've flown these aircraft. And that way they can read through it and learn a lot about the nuances before we jump into the airplane. If they're a student pilot, and I teach a lot of student pilots in the SR-20 to get their private license, then I give it to them in more bite-sized chunks. I don't give them, the entire document. I give them, small portions of it that have been, tailored to student pilots. So I would say that I'm pretty heavy on teaching, some of the basic systems and some of the ground information before anybody ever gets into the airplane, because it's pretty expensive to try and learn while that propeller is turning around out there.
Yep.
And I just don't think the cockpit is the optimal learning environment anyway. You're spending probably half your brain cycles just trying to stay alive, right? It's like, keep the wings level, and and it's hard to take in tons of new information when you're thinking about, I better not screw up. I don't want to mess up.
It's like when you're first learning how to fly, and then you got to work the radios and the airplane, and you're just like, if your instructor moves too fast, you're sitting there trying to fly the airplane, and something comes on the radio, and your instructor's like, why didn't you get that? And you're like, well, I'm still trying to fly the plane right now.
Yeah, and I got to tell you that as an instructor, I'm 50% dumber when I shift over to the left seat. It's pretty easy to be a smart guy when you're sitting in the right seat because you're not doing the work. You're just kind of monitoring the work. So I think that's important for CFIs is to remember as well too, which is why it's good for us to sometimes go out there and learn something new, so that we appreciate what our clients are going through when they're trying to learn something new.
I actually have a funny story about that. It's like, at least when you sit in the right seat, you get a little dumber per se. So my instructor just hopped off a Hawker 400 XP from a trip that he was on, and my lesson was scheduled right after. And I literally, like he said, have the prop going, and we're just gonna hop it and go, right? And so we're going out, we're practicing maneuvers. This is probably like 3 weeks or so before my check ride. And he's like, I don't want to do anything, right? And then I kept messing up my short field landings. He's like, here, I'll show you how to do it. And he just goes and botches the whole short field landing on accident, right? And I was just like, he did keep his airspeed and all this. And he's like, you know what? I admit, it's easier to sit in the right seat sometimes. And I was like, hey, it's okay. We're all learning here. So it's go ahead.
Yeah, and I think an important thing is, as an instructor, anytime we screw up, you have to admit it. You have to kind of go, okay, and I should have done this slightly differently. So when you do it, don't do it exactly the way I did. Because if you don't, then your clients are going to start to think, the way he did it, was the right way. Or they'll be on to you and they're like, oh man, this guy really, kind of lies. So, and that kind of, makes you worried about, all right, what else might they lie about? So yeah, you got to come clean. I think it's so incredibly important in aviation, to be upfront and honest about everything. A lot of people try and kind of hide their shortcomings, but ultimately, it's far better if you just admit, I didn't know what I should have known about that, because then you'll go out and learn about it, and you'll probably be safer as a result.
Yeah, nobody's going to be perfect every time they go flying, right?
Nope, can't happen.
So as you're moving through your students and you're instructing with them, obviously aviation safety is a very important topic that I've noticed on your blogs and your articles you stress on a lot. What would you say is kind of the most important or very important topics every time you go flying that you emphasize to your students?
Boy, I think one of the most important things on any flight is to just build lots of margin into every decision you make. So when I say that by margin, I mean you want to have a big cushion of safety between where you're at and where you might get into trouble. So for example, if stall speed is 45 knots, hey, don't ever get close slower than 60 knots or something like that. You just need margin in everything that you do. A less dramatic example would be, suppose you're flying right next to the edge of restricted airspace. Well, don't just go right up next to it, so that when you're looking at your iPad or the movie map that you're not quite touching it. It's like, stay at least a half mile away or a mile away or something like that. Same when you're flying over the top of clouds. Don't just skim the tops of them. You're supposed to be 1,000 feet above them, so get 1,000 feet above them. So I think it's important to build in extra margin into every single thing you do. And then I think pilots are often faced with alternatives and decisions. Hey, should I do A, or shall I do B? And anytime I'm kind of faced with a dilemma, gosh, I'm not sure if I should do A or should do B, I'll try and pick whichever is the more conservative option, which option is the safer. And if I'm in any doubt whatsoever as to what that might be, I literally do this. I'll kind of think, now, how will the accident report read, if I do B and things don't turn out well? And almost always that leads me to the right decision. I don't know about you, but I sure don't want to show up in an NTSB report somewhere because, people will go, wow, Max was a good pilot, but what the heck was he thinking when he did that?
The one time you do something wrong, it's going to be on your record forever, right?
Well, and actually, there's a really good point. I have unfortunately been to a number of pilot funerals over the years, and I attended one just about a month and a half ago. And when you go to these funerals, people always say, wow, he was such a great pilot. He was a really excellent pilot. And most of the time, the people are absolutely correct. That person was an excellent pilot. But that one time, they made one mistake that turned out to be, fatal. And often it's a series of mistakes. But still, it doesn't matter how good you are. You're only as good as your last decision. So you have to consistently make good decisions. And if you find that things are starting to stack up against you, for example, I have a rule of 2. I get to the second thing that isn't just quite working out. I'm like, all right, I'm out of here. It's like, it means either I'm not going to take off or, I'm going to land or I'm going to, I don't want to get to that third issue.
So for how many times you go, so for all the times you've gone flying, and there's certain situations as pilots, right? They say once you get your license, it's a license to go learn. So
yep, very true.
And when you get your license, for example, my instructor, he says anytime you don't know something, call another pilot, call your CFI, right? Call somebody who you trust and say, hey, I have this problem, this flight plan. What do you think? What would you do in this situation? My question for you is, 1, do you still call anybody in those situations that come up? Or 2, as you were progressing through your training, how did you cope with situations or deal with situations that you didn't know how to deal with?
So yes, number 1, I do still call people from time to time. Example that comes to mind was I had to fly to Southern California recently, and I know that as you fly through the special area across Los Angeles at 3,500 feet or 4,500 feet, there's specific things that you need to do. So I called a friend of mine who's a master CFI in SoCal, and it was a short conversation. It took 2 minutes. It was like, oh, okay, and more than anything, it was just like I wanted to double check. I just wanted to make sure. And so I always tell folks that they should do exactly that. They should reach out and call someone. And often, even if I've just flown with somebody one time, I'll tell them, here's my phone number, put it in your contacts. And if you ever find yourself at the end of the runway somewhere and you're not sure about something, just call me. I would far rather get a phone call from somebody and go, oh yeah, don't worry about that. That'll be fine. Versus, them not calling and turn out, man, it was a huge mistake that they made.
NTSB report, right?
Yep. So I do a lot of phase checks for the local flying club that I teach at. And they may have learned to fly a Cirrus from somebody else, and so I'm the kind of the last person they fly with just to make sure that they're doing everything correctly. And that may be the full extent of my relationship with them. I saw them for 3.5 hours, and still, I want them to call me. I want them to know, hey, I'm a Cirrus expert. Just, make sure that you never find yourself, wanting for an answer about something that's important. And then the second part of your question was, what did I do in those situations when I didn't know something in the past? I would say that I have done tremendous amounts of research. I've just always been, a consumer years ago of all the magazines. So even in those many years when I worked for HP, when I was only flying 30 hours a year, I would read magazines cover to cover, and I would, have charts next to my bed, and I'd study sectional charts, and I'd make sure that I knew every symbol on the chart. So a tremendous amount of self-study. And then, of course, when there's something you just can't figure out on your own, that's the time to call an expert. I would recommend that people seek out an expert when they're looking for an answer instead of what I see, and this just kind of drives me nuts. Someone posts a question on Facebook, and they get 30 different or 70 or 100 different comments from all their friends. And you know what? The answer is actually buried there in those comments, but they don't know, which of those 70 mostly dumb comments, are the correct answer. So, I would encourage people, don't just kind of throw it up there and, see what people say and then average it. Well, 70% said this and 30% said that. So it must be the 70%. I got to tell you, the conventional wisdom is often wrong on a lot of things. And I have seen this countless times, in aviation. Just because 70% of the people believe it doesn't make it true. So you really want to seek out experts and get expert advice rather than asking the average population what they think the answer is on an aviation question.
It's better to go find somebody who really knows their stuff, and that's why it's also good to know people who know their stuff as well.
Well, and this goes back to having a trusted relationship with your flight instructor. A good flight instructor will say, I don't know, but I'll look it up and I'll get back to you. A bad flight instructor will make stuff up.
It's always, the answer's always out there. Just a matter of how do I get the right one, right?
Indeed.
So, you mentioned the flight clubs, right? How did you kind of get involved in flight clubs? What's kind of the general premise? Because obviously I don't know anything yet about all the flight clubs in the local area and all that. And so if you can kind of explain to me the world of a flight club, how it works, and obviously you're the president of the Silicon Valley General Aviation, right? So that's a good starting point, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Be happy to. I would say that flying clubs come in many different, flavors, and you're going to find that they're different in different, regions of the country. In many regions of the country, you find flight schools in which somebody owns the flight school. All of the flight instructors are employees of that flight school, and everything kind of happens within the context of that flight school. At the particular airport that I fly at, there are about 5, maybe 6 flight schools that operate at the place, and actually I hesitate to call them flight schools. There are 5 or 6 clubs, that operate there, and none of them, to my knowledge, have employees that work for them. Typically, we have organizations, either profit or nonprofit, that are organized in a way that they find people who would like to, lease their aircraft to renters. And that club then, takes those aircraft and makes them available to people. They set the criteria for checking out members. Now, these members, they pay dues, but they don't own a portion of the aircraft. And so I'm an independent contractor, as are all the other flight instructors at the particular club that I fly at. So in many ways, it looks like a flight school, but it's very different in terms of how it operates. I think part of the reason that my particular airport tends to operate more this way is that we're in a fairly expensive part of the country, and a lot of flight schools who have employees pay flight instructors pretty poorly, especially if they know that these people are trying to build their hours so that they can go work for the airlines. It's pretty hard to be able to afford to live in this particular area on the salary that you might get paid by a flight school. And so, the independent contractor model, the club model just turns out working, much better for us, which means that I can make a better living as an independent contractor, as can all of the other instructors at all of the other clubs, at the airport that I do most of my flying out of here in Silicon Valley. I think there are lots of other kinds of clubs. in which, for example, the simplest case would be, two people get together and they say, hey, let's buy an airplane, and so these people, they're owners, right? They put up 50% of the down payment or 50% of the price, they buy an airplane, and they are, for all intents and purposes, a club. And then you can just kind of multiply, from there. Maybe it's 3 people and they have 2 airplanes, or maybe it's, 50 people and they have, 7 airplanes. I would say that a good ratio in general is about 10 members, per airplane. So if you've got 100 members, it probably supports about, 10 airplanes, somewhere, on that order. That provides enough availability, so that people can get an airplane when they want to. Of course, they are competing with each other. In general, people are more likely to want to rent an airplane on a weekend, than they are, in the middle of the week. But I would say that's kind of the rough, broad spectrum of clubs. And then you've got, pretty much everything in between.
And what's your independent contractor? How did you set that up? Obviously, because of your designations, that makes you very valuable towards anybody who, they read your resume and it's like, oh, that seems like a really good guy to go get lessons from. How many independent contractors out there compared to normal CFIs that get like kind of the flight salary, right? Flight school salary. And how does that get set up?
Well, I like the way you structured the question. Those people are normal CFIs. That must make me an abnormal CFI then, right?
Yeah, obviously, right. But that's just kind of the general.
I'm kidding. I have no idea. I would say that, in smaller towns, you're probably more likely to have and I'm not even sure that's the case. If you get to a really small town, you may have that one person, like it was in my town, who was everything. He was the flight instructor, the charter pilot, and he cut the grass, literally. And he was the mechanic. He did all the work, on all the airplanes. So I don't really know what the split is like. I think it's going to just vary a lot by different geographies. As a pilot learning to fly, it's really probably not going to matter too much whether you're learning to fly at a flight school that has employees versus a club that that has independent contractors. Ultimately, you still want the same thing. You want to perhaps interview a couple flight instructors, maybe even go with a demo flight for 1 or 2 of them, and find a person that you feel that you're going to have a good relationship with and you don't mind sitting shoulder to shoulder with for a number of hours. I'll give you one example. I've obviously had many flight instructors over the years, and the many different ratings that I check rides that I've done. I think I've done about 9 check rides by last count. So that tells you I've done a lot of had a lot of instructors. And of course, my joke is that and I finally passed after that 9th check ride. No, that's 9 different ratings, a couple seaplane ratings and ATP ratings and instrument ratings and on and on and on and on.
No big deal.
But but ultimately you want an instructor that that you trust, and that's what you're looking for. Because I had one instructor when I was working on my instrument rating who, early on, I realized the guy really made me grit my teeth every time I was with him. It was just painful. And I would say that, he was perhaps a bit of a narcissist, and he just always had to be right and kind of had to rub it in. And I was like, oh man, it was just painful, sitting with him. And unfortunately, I kind of thought, well, if I change flight instructors now, somehow I'm going to I will have lost some of the time, and I'll have to fly more hours than, I would if I just, grin and bear it and stick it out with this person. Bad mistake. If I were to go back now, I would have said, thank you very much. I'm not sure this is working. Find somebody else. And I doubt that it would have, cost me, an extra hour in terms of total time that I did. So, you got to really almost like the person. I mean, maybe you don't have to like them, but you've got to trust them and respect them.
Kind of a friend, but not really. You got to have that mutual respect. Probably friends out of the plane, but when you get in, it's instructor time, right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that you mentioned that it's kind of a friend. I know multiple people who have married their flight instructor.
Oh, wow. So that's that turned into more than a friend.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, close relationships do come out of this, and it's not surprising, right? I mean, your success kind of depends upon each other.
Yeah, and also they say that, if your first date you take the girl out and you do something adrenaline rush, she's more likely to come back the next time because you kind of gave her like a spike of adrenaline, But,
I'll remember that when I start dating again.
There you go. That's awesome. So you're as you're progressing through your ratings and you kind of develop yourself as, how did the Master CFI and all these designations come out? What's the process for that? Like if I say I want to be a Master CFI someday, how do I do that?
Sure. So the Master CFI, there are a couple of different things. There's a Gold Seal CFI. Let me talk about that first. That's a designation by the FAA. And essentially, as a flight instructor, if you have 8 out of 10 check rides, which are passes within, I believe it's a 2-year period, then you can apply to have the Gold Seal, applied to your flight instructor certificate. And once you do that, that Gold Seal, stays with you forever. And the plastic license you get is actually different. It's got the Gold Seal, which is really indicative of someone who's got a fairly high volume of clients. If they've sent 10 people for check rides, within the prior 2 years, and 80% of them passed. The Master CFI is a little bit different. That's essentially an application process. There are a number of requirements in terms of how much time you have as a CFI and so on. So someone who just became a CFI last year is not going to be able to achieve a master designation. And essentially, it's an application process. My recollection is that there are 4 major categories for which they're looking for documentation from you. And not only are they looking for a relatively high level of activity, but they're also looking to see, for example, have you created media? Are you writing articles? Are you creating YouTube videos? Are you doing things that provide kind of outreach to the public? Another area is volunteer work. Are you active in any local committees, airport commissions, other kinds of things where you are giving back to aviation as a volunteer? And then each of these different activities is credited a certain number of points, and then you add up all the points, and you have enough points, then you can apply. And provided you've filled out all the documentation and meet all the criteria, then you'll get a designation as a Master CFI. There's also a Master Ground Instructor designation, and so that's going to be similar but different. And a small number of us have done both. You have to have a lot of activity to be able to achieve the Master designation in both of those categories.
And was that just a goal for you? When did you know that you wanted to do that?
If I think about it, early on, I just somehow wanted to, just have some street cred. I wanted to have, something that kind of showed, oh yeah, he's not just the average Joe CFI. This guy is, special. And so that's something that I kind of looked at and thought, how, what are all the different things that, I need to do? I probably, if I look back at all the different pieces of documentation that I had to submit, probably I had done everything anyway. In other words, when I decided to become a Master CFI, I don't recall that I went above and beyond and did anything more than I was already doing, because I was just already so incredibly active. For another example would be giving seminars. In the past, I've often given probably 15 presentations a year. Some of those are local wings program safety seminars, which I'll give. And the nice thing about those is that once you register with the FAA, they'll put that in the system, and then they'll email, in my case, locally here, about 3,000 local pilots. And, 40 or 50 of them will show up for the presentation. And it's just a great way for pilots to learn information, CFIs to get exposure to potential new clients, and to have a kind of a general kind of education kind of process that goes on, outside of the normal, flight instructor regimen. So I was doing lots of all of those kinds of things anyway. So for me, I didn't really have to go out of my way to do anything special. It was just a matter of documenting all the things that I was already doing. For other folks who aren't doing all those things, you'd have to look at it and go, oh, gee, I better write an article, or gee, I better start giving more seminars, or, maybe I should volunteer for more groups, and, things like that.
How does that come about when you're like, how do you just do seminars, right? Do you have to know people that get you into it, or is that kind of something that you say, hey, I got all these flight hours and I have some pretty valuable information that I can share? Like, how do you get into that?
Well, so I would say it helps to have some presentation skills. I'm lucky. For me, it started back in high school. I took a course on, it was called speech class, and it was all about how to give presentations. I also worked at the local radio station as a disc jockey for a couple years in high school. I actually worked for a total of 5 different radio stations through high school and college, including at one point in time I worked for CBS, which was kind of fun. I was a CBS employee. So I always kind of enjoyed, being on stage, as it were, or, being behind the microphone, that helped because it helps to be able to have some presentation skills to begin with. And then you just want to feel like you've got some information that you'd like to be able to share. And often, as you put together a presentation, you're going to find that you're going to learn a little bit more in the process. Most of the time when I put together a presentation, I have a rough idea and I may know 80% of the material. But as I flesh out the little different, pieces that I don't really quite know, I learn something, in the process. And so if you go through that, it's not unusual for you to, know more about a particular topic than most of the people, who show up. And so, if you've got decent presentation skills, you've done a little research and, a particular topic well, then you just need to find a venue to give it. And I would say most flight schools are looking for CFIs or even non-CFIs who are interested in giving, these kinds of presentations.
That is, a couple topics there. One, you mentioned about how you kind of just wanted to be the best in whatever you did. Like, I respect that so much because there's so many people out there who are just like, they just do the minimum, right? They're not going to go above and beyond. And I personally really admire that you're able to say, hey, not only am I going to be a CFI, I'm going to be one of the best CFIs out there. Why? Because that's just who I am as a person. So I really respect that. Two, obviously, I think everything you do in life is all the skills you did speech class in high school or whatever, they all add up later on in life, right? I think if you think back, you're like, oh man, what if I didn't do that speech class? Would I have used those skills later on in life? So I think that's very important that you use everything you have learned in life in order to achieve your goals. And three, you mentioned how that you learn more as you're teaching, right? As you're teaching others. They say that CFIs learn more about piloting than they ever would through their training, right? Because they're going through all the topics, they're teaching students, and they'll learn more from their students than they ever did in their flight training, right? They'll pick up on topics that they never really touched on before.
And I found the same thing true in producing my podcast. So I do the Aviation News Talk podcast every week. And initially I didn't, and the reason I started doing it, by the way, was that I'd been a co-host for years on the Airplane Geeks podcast. But there are multiple co-hosts. It covers a lot of topics besides just general aviation. And I found that there would be many days I'd climb out of the airplane and I think, wow, I've just gotten, a new insight that I want to, share with people. There just wasn't enough time to do that on Airplane Geeks. But Aviation News Talk became a way for me to share, all the many different insights on a particular topic that I come up with. And the thing that has really surprised me that I didn't expect was how much I have learned, first by researching to do some of the episodes, but even more so, how much I've learned from the listeners who then contact me afterwards and say, hey, loved episode 113. And oh, by the way, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that way we've got a community that's working together and we're all, learning from each other.
The pursuit of knowledge is the ultimate goal, right? Because if we can make everybody else safer as pilots through our own collective knowledge, I think that's the end of the day, we're all winning, right?
Totally true. I tell folks that their goal as a pilot is mastery of the aircraft, which means you want to learn everything you possibly can about that airplane and about aviating in general, because you just never know what one obscure fact will be the one thing that can save your life. So I'm highly motivated when I'm involved in something that could kill me. I mean, just to be candid. And so, I want to learn everything else I can about it because I don't want to be an NTSB statistic.
It is life or death, and most people don't actually realize that because we do it all the time, right? We go flying, it's no big deal. But at the end of the day, it's like, hey, I am thousands of feet in the air right now. If something were to go wrong, you better be dang sure that you know exactly what's going on. And to touch on your topic about other people knowing stuff about the guy contacting you, I remember I was in my instrument ground school class, and we used to start talking about the ADSB and all kind of the requirements for it coming up. And this one guy in the back of the class, right, never really talked much. And then all of a sudden you see him just light up, right? He starts going off about all the avionics, everything, and these different types of plane, how they're going to work. Yeah. And literally everybody in the class goes, right? It's one of those moments where it's like this guy's just going off talking about things that nobody in the class would ever know. But his one thing is like, hey, he wanted to really know about avionics and how they all work and all this. And I think that's why everybody learned in the classroom that day. And so it's so important to really listen to people when they have information to share, right?
Yeah, that's one of the advantages of going to an in-person ground school. You can do, all the knowledge transfer that you need to do to get your private or instrument by reading books or taking online classes. But if you're able to go to an in-person ground school, yeah, you learn so much from other people, and it's just great to have someone there who can answer any particular questions you have in real time.
And when you're doing your Aviation News Talk podcast, you said you started it because you just wanted to, if you had a thought in your head, you said, hey, I want to put it out there. But
sure.
What's the main goal for it when you're trying to spread all this aviation knowledge? Like, for example, I took the time to listen to your buzzing one, right?
Sure.
Exactly, right?
And we did that episode to teach people how to do that, right? No, that's not why we did that episode.
100%. Because it's, honestly though, like I'm a 19-year-old male. There's a reason that insurance is higher on for male car drivers, right? It's the same thing when it goes for planes, is because every single time you hear the stories about pilots in my family that, they go out and they've in the desert, they buzzed us while we were off-roading or whatever out in the dunes. And it's just like, it's not safe because of so many different factors, but it's something that always enters your head. And I said, hey, I'm going to take the time, listen to this. And the information that you provided on that topic was so interesting, because it's like, hey, there may be obstructions that you don't know about in the general area. There may be wires hanging down. I think you talked about the one guy, and he was buzzing over a lake, and there was a wire on the other side, and he didn't do the scouting. And you said, hey, I went on to the like a general satellite map, and I looked at the lake, and you said there was a wire you could easily see on the internet. And I was just like, I was like, he didn't even, the pilot didn't even think to go do that before he wants to go show off for whoever he's showing off to, right? Yeah.
And in that case, it was marked on the FAA sectional chart. All he had to do was, pull out an app that he might have, like ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, look on the sectional and like, oh, that's the part of the lake where the power line crosses. But, the good thing is that even though he didn't survive, hopefully people listening to us today will kind of go, oh, good idea. I should check out obstructions. And you ask about the goal for Aviation News Talk podcast. I would say the overriding goal is, I'd like to be able to save some lives. I've had at least one person who said, something you told me actually saved my life. And that's the kind of, thing that you can't put a price on. So yes, my goal is just to educate pilots, have a little bit of fun in the process, and also, pass along safety tips that will keep them safer.
Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah, indeed. Francis Bacon, I believe, said that.
Yeah, yep. And my other, I think this is kind of getting a little morbid for people. Did you know anybody personally that passed away through aviation?
Oh, yeah.
In your life?
Yeah.
And
I've been to probably 5 different pilot funerals. So, yeah, not fun.
And it was through aviation accident, I'm assuming, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you never know,
absolutely.
I'd ask.
Yeah.
But,
no.
What was your, because I don't think that's something I've never experienced, and I don't know too many other pilots who have, who've kind of expressed that with me. What is that like for you on an emotional level, as a pilot and also as a person, having to kind of deal with that? How do you process?
Yeah, so I think that, part of, funerals is it's an opportunity for people to get together to, grieve a little bit, but also to celebrate the, the person's life, and to maybe put a little bit of closure, on the episode, even though, some of these things you never really get, full closure on. And so I know I'm always torn a little bit, about going to a funeral, but I usually find that if it's someone that I, had some kind of relationship with, that ultimately I end up feeling, better, for having gone. And, I may learn, and part of the, I'd hate to say the fun of it, but one of the benefits of going is just learning how many other people love that person, and, learning more about them that you probably didn't know, because we all have different, slices of a person's life. So I think it's a beneficial, process, even though, if you kind of think about it in the abstract, you're like, oh, this might make me sad. I don't think I want to go. I think it's helpful.
It's always a learning experience, right?
Yeah.
And it's learn from others' mistakes, so hopefully we don't repeat them ourselves. And so I think, moving past that note, you started the G1000. What made you? I mean, you started the G1000 company. It was What was the G1000 stuff you started again?
Sure.
The book, right?
Yeah, Glass Cockpit Publishing is my company, and my first book was Max Trescott's G1000 Garmin G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit.
And
Handbook.
why specifically that? What made you say, "Hey, I want to write a whole entire book about the G1000"? Right?
Boy, I didn't really want to write it. Let me tell you what happened. In 2005, I went back to Independence, Kansas with a client to pick up his brand new Cessna 206 and fly with him back to California. The G1000 had just been put into Cessnas in 2004, so it was a very new glass cockpit system. Neither of us was very familiar with it. At the time, Cessna was offering, I believe it was a full 3, maybe 4-day class. In fact, it was at least 4 days, because I remember they shortened it later to 3. So we spent most of a week learning how to use the system. Then we hopped into the airplane and flew it back across the country. And I remember thinking when I got home, I'd had a big pile of notes that I had taken while I was there. And this is literally what I thought. I said to myself, why am I having such a hard time learning this system? And I remember thinking, gee, I'm kind of a smart guy, and I'm trained as an electrical engineer. This is an electronic system. Why is this, so difficult? And what I thought was, really, wow, there isn't much really good documentation, out on the system, which is why I think it was hard to learn. And within a week or two, I kind of thought, oh, geez, someone really needs to write a book about this. Oh, no. I'm probably the guy that needs to do it. And I had, taken a lot of excellent notes. I probably had, 18, 20 pages of, single space type notes when I got back from there. So I had a lot of good core material, and I just thought, oh, right, I guess I'm the one to do this. And I knew something about book publishing. One of the things I did when I was at Hewlett Packard is I managed a group that used to publish a 500-page book every year, which listed all of the instrument products that the instrument side of the company had for sale. And we would print about 200,000 of these books every year. I mean, it was one of the things I did. I bought almost $1 million worth of paper a year. So wow. It was a major process. So I had learned a fair amount about book publishing. I thought, well, what the heck? I guess I'll do that. And I'm glad I did. It's, one thing I've told my kids is, if you really want to put yourself on the map, write a book. I was kind of amazed at kind of the credibility that comes from that. People are like, oh, that must be the expert. And in some sense you are, because you had to figure all that stuff out to write the book.
Yeah, that must be the expert, right? And you get people that are writing children's stories and like, oh, they're the expert in children's stories, right? But I think that's so funny. I've personally learned throughout my journey that academia and the aspect of publishing is crazy. It's like a full-on world for people who are trying to get into writing the books and doing it, because there's like multiple editing processes. You have to go through publishers. Nice cat, by the way.
Yeah.
See a cat in the background.
All right, good.
No, you're good. And so I've always just thought, one, that's always a great item to have, because it's like a piece of you that you can give out to somebody, right? Your words on paper are somebody that, hey, that's Max Trescott when he's writing about the G1000. Anyways, but... yeah, so it's kind of random, crazy story. But
and I will tell you that the writing part is fun, and that's only about 10% of it. There's all the other stuff, and that stuff is less fun. But if you're really committed, then yeah, and you got something you're passionate about, do it. It's like anything else. You'll figure it out.
Amen. And so just a basic G1000 question. So I've
by the way, just I've got the book right here, so I'll look it up real quickly if I don't know. Go ahead.
Need to reference it. Just generally moving from steam gauges to the G1000, what would be your tip?
And which have you done, by the way?
I've only done steam gauges.
Okay. So I would say that, tip. I think it's worthwhile to do some pre-study ahead of time. As we mentioned before, the learning in the cockpit is not the world's best learning environment. So if you can read a book ahead of time, or watch some videos, or even sit with a flight instructor in front of a simulator that has a G1000, you're going to find that a very cost-effective use as your time. Because if you only learn while that propeller is turning, it's going to be slower and more expensive to learn. So I'd look at some other resources and do some outside study before the first time you yell clear and start the engine.
Yep. Yeah, every time I think in aviation, basically what I've been stressing to, I have friends who are just starting off in their pilot training and all this.
Sure.
And I always say, every time you go flying, you have to make sure that you know everything before you go into that lesson. Think of the lesson as the test, and whatever your CFI told you to study, you got to have it down 100%, so that way when you get inside, you're ready to go. And I think the same thing probably goes for switching from G1000 to steam gauges or whatever in aviation.
Boy, Justin, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking there might be a future flight instructor here. Is that something you're thinking of doing someday? Because I think that was great advice.
Thank you. That's personally something I have been. Yeah, I take some buddies up and I kind of walk them through, straight and level turns and all that, because that is a goal one day of mine. I've always been, I was athletic in high school. I was I tutored people as well. And my big thing was I loved going down, like for personally in sports, right? I would go and help the freshmen. Why? Because I just loved seeing them when it clicks, right? Because not only is it the knowledge, like, hey, on your drop step, make sure you're pointing your foot at this pole or whatever, right?
Right.
And for me, when they do it and then you see them turn and look at you like, hey, you're the coolest guy in the world automatically.
That's great.
To me, that was kind of the most important thing. And so I love sharing the passion of aviation, period. Because I'm very fortunate. I'm 19 years old, have my private pilot license. Granted, I've worked my butt off for it. And two, when I'm able to take my friends up, right, it's like, it's the greatest thing in the world for me to share that with somebody.
Well, that's great. It sounds like you've got all the skills, necessary to become a CFI in the future. So definitely consider doing that, because I think you'll have a lot of fun. Indeed. Why not? Ta-da. And we're back.
100%. So your podcasting kind of career, I kind of want to dive into that a little bit.
Sure.
What was, why'd you want to get into it? Obviously you said you wanted to just go out there, but your time as a co-host, what was that like?
It was a great learning experience. I'm still co-hosting on that show. I've been doing that for, over 6 years, I think now at this point, more than half the life of that show. That's one of the longest running aviation podcasts, Airplane Geeks. And it was good training wheels. It really helped me learn a lot of different aspects of podcasting. And then when I decided to dive in and do my own, that's when I discovered, oh my gosh, I was just seeing the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more that was happening behind the scenes that I was unaware of. And what I also learned is it's time consuming. It takes me a full day per week probably to get a show out, and sometimes more than that. So yeah, it was a great way to learn some of the basics. And of course, now going off and doing it has just been pure fun. For me, it's also a little bit of an outlet. I loved when I was a disc jockey behind the microphone at radio stations years ago. And when I left college, I really had a tough decision. I had to decide, do I continue into the radio world? And I actually did some interviews with both one with ABC and one with CBS Radio, both of those in New York, on the engineering side of things, actually, even though most of my work had been behind the microphone. Or should I go into this thing called, high tech? And I think I made a good choice. But I always kind of miss the live behind the microphone, and podcasting is a little close to that. Fortunately, it's not live, so I can make myself sound better with, judicious edits here and there.
You can cut out whatever you don't like and do like, which is always fantastic,
Indeed, yeah.
And so I actually want to dive into kind of your extra career a little bit. You got a bachelor's in psychology that I saw first. And what was why'd you want to do that, right? What was the thought process?
It's a good question. So I was one of those folks who went into college and didn't really know 100% for sure, what I wanted to do when I grew up, if I grew up. And I went in, declared myself as a math major because I was fairly good in math in high school, and I kind of thought maybe I'd be interested in pre-med because my dad was a doctor. But the funny thing is, I never really liked being in the hospital where he worked. I was always uncomfortable. I just did not like, being there. And over time, I think I kind of figured out, it would be. In my mind, it was just kind of a giving profession. It's one where you're helping other people, and to me, that was what attracted to me about medicine. I think conversely, the thing that scared the heck of me about medicine was I was always worried that I might someday make a decision that would result in somebody dying. And I think over the years, I've kind of realized, yeah, that's just a given, with that profession. You can't be right 100% of the time. And, over a 40 plus year career, there'll probably be at least one time where, you make a bad decision and someone doesn't live as long as they might have otherwise. But, in college, after I kind of decided, well, not pre-med, I was really interested in psychology for a lot of different reasons, but I just wasn't sure that there was a career there, for me in it. And so in my second year in college, I started engineering. So I actually stayed a fifth year to finish my engineering degree. And I'm really glad I did, because I think that helped get into the high-tech career. Would have been almost impossible at that point in time to get into high-tech without an engineering degree of some type. So that helped launch that particular career for me. And then aviation has just been always something that I've done for fun on the side.
A passion. So how did you transport from Pennsylvania to Silicon Valley, right? Or like, when did that happen? And you're just like, oh, hey, I'm moving to California, or you just what?
It happened for the same reason. It happened for the same reason that everything happens. The girlfriend.
Right. You took her. You said, I got to take her flying in California. There you go. The ultimate rush. Views and planes, right?
So I met my wife in college. She was my girlfriend at the time. And when I was looking for jobs after college, I tended to look at ones that were in the New York City area, since that's where she lived at the time. We got married a couple years later. We lived in New Jersey because I chose a job with HP in New Jersey because that was close by. And then we had a temporary assignment in California about 4 or 5 years after I joined the company. And we spent time in Silicon Valley, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. And I just saw that there was a lot of opportunity here because there was a lot more high tech going on here than there was in New Jersey at the time. So after we spent a winter out here, I just looked for other opportunities to get a paid transfer, and ultimately, found a job where the company would pay to relocate me. And we've been here for 30 years now, and I love this part of the country. And the downside is it's ridiculously expensive, to buy houses, around here. The upside is, a lot of interesting things going on. I'll give you one example. I live here in Mountain View, which is, nobody had ever heard of Mountain View until Google. Google is headquartered, in Mountain View. Yep. And I was thinking just yesterday as I was driving the local streets, I wonder how many other people in America constantly see different variations of self-driving cars going down their local streets. I think Mountain View must be the most mapped system of streets in the entire world. I can think of probably at least 3-4 different companies with self-driving cars that have been driving all over the city. And you often see cars that are totally unmarked with all kinds of weird gadgets, stuck onto them. So you never know in that case, is that, one engineer working out of the garage, or is that a secret project from, a large company? But to me, that's just part of the fun and the excitement of being here. Plus, the flying is spectacular. I lived in New Jersey probably about a third of the time. Local people would say, can't go flying, too windy, too this, too rainy, too, whatever. Around here, I tell folks that it's VFR 97% of the time. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. We get almost no rain here from probably the middle of May till the middle of September. And so every day is a flying day.
That's awesome, because most people don't actually get the chance to go flying in VFR if they're in other parts of the country. So I actually have a fun story about that. I had an air traffic controller on here a little bit ago, and he was an air traffic controller up in Seattle, right? And so they have a land runway and a water runway as well. And obviously there's always rain, right, in Seattle. And so apparently the cloud bases are high enough so that they can do laps in the pattern and stuff. And he said these guys didn't care, rain, snow, water, whatever. They said as long as they're beneath the clouds, these guys are taking off, landing, wet runways, snow. They didn't care. And he said you come here in California and it's like, oh, it's drizzling right now. We're not flying. So I always thought that was super interesting, the different kind of aspects of where you can fly and the different conditions of it. Super interesting. And as far as, so moving on to kind of just general how you got to where you were and the kind of the aspects of it. Obviously, you said you had that fire in your heart and in your head. You said, I'm going to be the best at what I did. What's inspired that for you? Was there people in your life, or was it kind of emotional events for you, or what made you into who you are?
Boy, it's a good question. I don't know that I have a specific answer, for that. Certainly I think my parents both valued education and, kind of, pushed me. And gosh, even at the dinner table, my English was being constantly corrected so that I had, proper grammar and, things like that. Anytime I was doing writing, folks at school were always making sure that my, writing was really excellent. And that helped for a lot of things, in terms of, writing books and writing magazine articles and all of that kind of thing. It's funny. I remember a college interview that I did for an Ivy League college that I did not get into. And I remember the interviewer said something about, and I'm always looking for people who are, expert at that one thing. And I remember saying to him, well, that's not my philosophy. I like to be good at, lots of different things. Didn't get in, although, was very happy ultimately with my college choice. But I think that has struck me over the years. And I think I have kind of recognized that in general, I think people do tend to be more successful if they kind of pick that one thing and get really good at that one thing, as opposed to being a jack of all trades, being, kind of very good at many things. I think there's a better case to be made to being expert at kind of that one thing. And so that's kind of shaped, what I've been doing. And I think that that's not a bad way to go. There's certainly nothing wrong with having 2 or 3 good things that you really, pursue a lot. But I think there's a lot to be said for specialization and trying to be the best you can at something, because that tends to set you apart. And then people will, seek you out for, because of your reputation and your knowledge.
What it takes to be great. You can either hire the local handyman down the street to fix the toilet, or you can kind of hand to the plumber, right? Hire the plumber. And so I think that's kind of one of the things that in your life you had a bunch of CFIs, right? Mm-hmm. What made, obviously in the cockpit, you're looking to that CFI. If something goes wrong, if something were to happen, or you're learning from, he's a leader for you, right? Mm-hmm. What makes someone a good leader in your eyes?
I think, for CFIs that kind of look beyond just, the flying part and can look a little bit deeper and, find ways that, they can help you and mentor you and, lead you. One of the things that I actually wrote to a CFI, an older gentleman, just in the last year or two, and said, hey, I just wanted to really thank you, for something that you really helped me on. And it's a funny kind of thing, but I'll always remember him for looking beyond kind of just the check ride and just the, teach him the facts and so on. I have failed only one check ride in my life, which is a pretty good record, I think, considering I've done 4 different ATP check rides and a lot of other stuff. And that was my commercial check ride. And I was in my 30s at the time, and I got incredibly upset, and I didn't handle it, as well as, I would these days. And he said, this was Fred Clegg. Fred said, Max, you really need to look at the way you handle failure. And I don't think that fully sunk in initially, but over time it did sink in. And, that one little comment, I just thought that was incredibly helpful, for me in my life in a way that went far beyond, a check ride for my commercial certificate. So I think that CFIs can provide great leadership to their clients, their community, the people that they're exposed to, by going just a little bit beyond. Don't just tell somebody how to land well. If you see that there's something else that's perhaps, impinging, upon them because of, something else going on in their life, then, take a risk and go ahead and just kind of point out, hey, you might want to think about, this, for example. I'll give you an example where I didn't engage on that level. I've had only one client who had an incredible anger problem, I would say. And this was a rather toxic pilot. I ended that relationship without pointing out, gee, you really might want to take a look at your anger problem and see how this is affecting.
He's a therapist, right?
Yeah, affecting not only us in the cockpit, but it may be affecting you in other parts of your life. So.
Yeah, that's very important. Obviously, your attitudes when you're working with somebody in a cockpit, flying with other pilots. And so when you're in aspects of leadership, has there anybody been in your later half of your life that you've kind of looked to still as someone who inspires you personally? Or
It's kind of funny. I look back over life and think about, have I had any, real mentors per se? And I would say, no, there really haven't been any people who've kind of reached out to me and said, hey, I want to help, mentor you. I probably could have done a better job, asking, for people to be mentors. And I think that's something that I would just pass along to other folks is, don't just wait for someone to reach out to you to be a mentor. Reach out to them and say, hey, I admire what you do and wonder if you could help me and mentor me in these, particular kinds of ways. And, conversely, I would say that, for those of us who've been around for a while, look for people who, probably could use, a little bit of mentoring. I remember almost 20 years ago when I was teaching an instrument ground school that there was somebody in the class who looked like they were really looking for more from me than in terms of guidance and relationship and so on, than just the context of, teaching a ground school. And at that particular point in time, I didn't really see myself as a mentor, and so I didn't kind of respond in a way that they were probably looking for. I don't know that I could have truly helped them in the things that they were looking for, but I kind of realized years later, oh yeah, there was an opportunity that I was just not primed for and able to help somebody with. But yeah, I think people on both sides of the equation should look for these opportunities and take a risk and ask somebody. I should probably have done that more in my past.
It's definitely a responsibility, though, too, when you think about it, because if you choose to really take somebody under your wing, you have to uphold your own standards, one, and also uphold what they think of you, And I think that's the most important part for people who do choose to be mentors is that, one, I think they're able to grow from the responsibility as humans, It's people later on in life. That's kind of something I've always looked for, or people that I can learn from, right? They say it's not about where you want to get, it's who you're going to learn from to get there, because whether that's a book or whether that's a person, somebody wrote that book, right? Somebody reads your G1000 book and they're like, oh, hey, Max Trescott, he knows his stuff about the G1000. And so therefore you automatically become a mentor. Like a quote, we talked, Francis Bacon, right?
Sure.
For the automatically that quote comes to mind. It's like, okay, this person was able to influence the lives of other people, and I think that's definitely one of the most important things, not only in aviation but in life, that we need to do in order to help out those around us.
Good. Well, I was going to say you've learned a lot at an early age already, so I think you're far ahead of where I was at your age. So you're on a good track there, Justin.
Thank you. I try my best, but obviously I still got a lot of growing to do and a lot of aviation to learn about, so that's why I'm doing my best to get out there, spread the word, and also bring along people like myself. I was right after a little bit about me. I was an athlete in high school. I was like D1 bound. I was going to go to these colleges, and then all of a sudden I went flying, right? And I'm like, oh hey, this is this is the greatest thing in the world. And
it is. Not
only that, it's like, one, sports don't pay the bills. Two, this is like a career. I can do this for fun. To get paid to do it, and it's also fun. And my thing was, like, when I first started my training, you'd come back to the ramp and you see all these pilots hopping in their jets and all these things. And it's just like, all these people have a story. All these people are unique in aviation. Everybody has their struggles, the things that they had to go through in order to get to where they are now. Some people, like, for example, I had a guy who's 58 or whatever in my private pilot ground school when I was first started learning how to fly.
Wow.
And
yeah.
I talked to him and I say, hey, because I always say life is like an RPG game in the aspect of just go talk to everybody. Why? Because everybody's kind of fun to talk to, But I talked to him. I was like, hey, you definitely are kind of one of the older people here, not in a bad way, but like, what made you want to get your private pilot license now? And he's like, I'm at a point in my life, I worked for most of it, and I just want to learn how to fly so I can be able to take my grandkids up and be able to go flying. And I think that's just one of the most beautiful things is no matter what age you are, you can always inspire others. You can always become better. You can always learn. Especially when it comes to aviation. That's why I'm saying the world is so big. I was talking to a guy last week. He flies a Chipmunk. And he's like part of that little elite club of people, and they all know each other. And I thought that was the coolest thing. He's like, yeah, I got a guy in New Orleans I know that flies one. And like, we kind of all met up at like this big event. I forget what the name of it was. And it's just like, it's crazy because we are in a travel industry. And so your world becomes so much bigger, right? You can have friends in every single different state. And to me, I think that's the most beautiful thing. And I want to be able to go and inspire that 16-year-old kid in high school that's like, hey, you can do this, right? You can be that 17-year-old flying. And so, yeah, that's just kind of what I've always thought about aviation. And that's why I'm doing my best to learn. And so I appreciate you coming on and giving us some of your knowledge. And, yeah.
Well, and I will tell you that with my two careers, first in high tech and then in aviation, I like the aviation a little better. I think that if you look at the people, most of them are in it because they truly love it. Some of the folks that I ran into high tech, they were not in it because they loved it, but it, paid the bills, so they weren't as passionate or having as much fun. Oh my gosh, aviation people are so much fun to hang out with. They enjoy life and they enjoy their hobby, and usually they're on a high when they're flying, so they're feeling good and they're just fun to be around. So, yeah, I would encourage anybody who's kind of got a love for aviation. Hey, come on in, join us in the industry. There's a lot of need for a lot of people in all kinds of jobs, not just pilots, but mechanics and flight attendants and people who work on the ramp and so on. So, yeah, come join us in aviation. You'll have a lot more fun than you will in some other industries. You may not make as much money as you might make in some other industries, but at the end of the day, you got to have fun, and you will have fun in aviation.
Always love what you're doing. So thank you today for coming on, Max. And obviously, everybody who's listening, go check out Aviation News Talk Podcast. Go check out his book about the G1000. Anything else you want to plug? Now's your chance.
Sure, exactly. Yeah, you can find the book at G1000book.com. There's a phone number there where you can just pick up the phone and order it. And of course, if you don't want to reach me, just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact at the top of the page. I also answer listener questions. You can click on listener questions and record a question, and I'll use those in the podcast. So yeah, you can find Aviation News Talk wherever you find podcasts.
Awesome. And JPL Aviation is where leadership in aviation take off. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And yeah, I'll call it a day.